All right. Welcome back, everyone. It is currently 8:26 p.m. Central Time, Thursday, March 7th. Uh, Meant to get an episode out last week, ended up not doing so. Instead, I chose to go see Dune Part 2 in theaters for the premiere, and it was incredible. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it. I almost debated doing a whole episode about it. It's truly incredible. Like, probably the best movie I've seen in a decade. And it's an event like Avengers Endgame was an event, but it's much better of a movie than Avengers Endgame. It's truly, I think, the closest thing we've had to Lord of the Rings since Lord of the Rings. Dark Knight is probably up there too, the Dark Knight trilogy. But Dune Part 2, if you haven't seen it, even if you have seen it already, go see it again. Um, So, anyway, like I was saying, pushed a podcast episode back a week. And fortunately, I did because we have some topics to discuss that came out this week. I'll start with Denver releasing Russell Wilson. Not a huge surprise. We had a feeling that Russell Wilson was going to uh, get cut this offseason. And just goes to show that the deal for Russell Wilson, the acquisition for Russell Wilson, is going to go down as not one of, but the worst trade in NFL history. And look, I got to eat crow on this one. I mocked Seattle on my blog. I mocked Seattle for trading him. I thought, at the time, I thought Russell Wilson was an elite quarterback, and you just don't move on from guys like that. And, in hindsight, like the signs were there. Even though I thought he was elite, I had some issues with Russell Wilson. He's too corny for me. He's very robotic. He just doesn't, there are times he just doesn't seem like a human. And I don't mean that in a good way. Like, and he's just so corny, after the game, his interviews after games were like always made me cringe. Then I think it was his last year in Seattle, he had the whole mock game before a game while he was injured, and then he had this story that he rehabbed for 18 hours a day or something ridiculous. And then he got to Denver and said like how he had been on vacation and watched film every single day, like watched every game. Like, it was just such bullshit. And like I said, there were signs of there was clearly something wrong with him in Seattle. Like all those reasons I just said. Then you had guys in the locker room, Richard Sherman being one of them, that kind of spoke out against him and said, I don't know, I don't recall what exactly they said, but kind of spoke out against him and said, hey, like, he's not, I guess not as good as y'all think he is. Or, he's not the reason why Seattle is doing so well. And that has turned out to be true. Pete Carroll had success without Russell Wilson. Seattle had success without Russell Wilson. But the acquisition of Russell Wilson is going to go down as the worst trade in NFL history. And as I was saying, I have to eat crow on this one. I thought Seattle was making a huge mistake. I thought Denver was getting away with highway robbery. You easily would trade 2 firsts and a couple average players for a quarterback who at the time I thought was elite in Russell Wilson. And that has backfired. Seattle has turned those picks into really good players. Charles Cross is, really good offensive lineman. Devin Witherspoon last year, really good DB. Or maybe they used the pick on Jackson Smith and Jigba. No, I think Witherspoon the was used with the Denver pick. Um, but Seattle, the clear winner of that trade. As for Denver, it had to be done. Even though, Russell Wilson really wasn't that bad last year. I was watching Colin Cowherd go over the numbers, and he actually ranked like in the top half of the league in a couple stats. But clearly it wasn't working with Sean Payton and Russell Wilson. Now, I think they're jumping the gun here. I would have given it another year because now they're incurring like an absurd dead cap. I think, what, upwards of $50 million in dead cap that they have to pay him. Russell Wilson dead cap. No. I think it was like 50 million just this year, but after Russell leaps 85 million in dead cap. Yeah, 85 the next 2 seasons. Okay, that sounds right. Um just goes to show how Sean Payton was sick of working with Russell Wilson to the point where they're willing to pay him $85 million to just go away. And, I don't want to get hung up on the money because, James and I have both said that if it's not working, just you got to pivot and move on. Don't worry about the money. But 85 million is an awful lot of money. And you know, where does Denver go from here? They don't really have an option on the roster. Jarrett Stidham's not a starting quarterback. Well, then you say, well, they'll go out and spend in free agency. Well, you have to pay Russell Wilson $85 million the next 2 years. I understand your owner is stupid rich and comes from Walmart and has money, but that's a lot of money to go out there and spend in free agency to go get someone, because they're not likely not getting Kirk Cousins. Maybe they get Justin Fields, who I'll talk about here in a minute. I don't know. But now Denver is in a point where they have to draft someone. I don't even think that's a debate. They have to use a first round pick on a quarterback. As for Seattle, I mean, I'm sorry I was wrong. I really hammered into you guys on my blog a couple years ago. Couldn't have been more wrong. I'll be the first one to admit it. Seattle got the better end of that deal. They were right. I was wrong. So that's that. The other story I wanted to touch up on was the Buffalo Bills releasing several good players. I believe Micah Hyde won one. I think it was Jordan Poyer, Mitch Morse, Tre'Davious White, and a couple other players. It was a tough, and I believe this happened Wednesday night. It was a tough day/night for the crowd that thinks the salary cap isn't real. Believe me, it's real. And it will come back to bite you. And Buffalo, this feels like the end of its Super Bowl window. Not entirely, but as I've said with Kansas City, these dynasties typically, not dynasties, because Buffalo's not a dynasty, but your windows typically come in phases. And I thought Kansas City's best window was between 2018 and 2021 when they had Tyreek Hill, along with the other players that they had on their roster. They traded them, they rounded out the roster, and surprisingly, very surprisingly, have won back-to-back Super Bowls the last 2 years with a, lesser roster than what they had from, I would say, 2018 to 2021, although not that much worse. But this feels like the end of the first phase of Buffalo's Super Bowl window with Josh Allen. Josh Allen, I would say their window opened in 2020. That was when Josh Allen's stock took off. They were playing really well. They got to the AFC Championship. And then I don't think they were big spenders that offseason. I don't remember. But, the next year they had Kansas City beat. They had them 13 seconds left and lost. And then, well, that was 2021. So 2022, they lost to the Chiefs again, right? Or was that the Bengals? It was the Bengals. And they lost to the Chiefs in 2023. So their window was 2020 to 2023. And now they've moved on from a bunch of guys, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And it feels like that first phase is over in Buffalo. Now Buffalo is going to have to get under the cap. They've done that. They've restructured Von Miller's contract, which that's been a disaster. And now they really have to round out the roster. I would probably look into trading someone, i.e. Stephon Diggs, who it's been a little tumultuous with him. I know the last year or so, trying to get him to, I guess, stay focused. I don't know, but there has been tension between him and the front office dating back to the summer, and he just didn't play all that well. You know, you had that game against Kansas City in the playoffs. Josh Allen throws it in the bucket 50 yards down the field, and it goes through Stephon Diggs' hands. So that's one I'd look to maybe get some draft capital. But Buffalo really needed to get younger defensively. That was evident against Kansas City. They were really banged up. And Buffalo didn't lose that game because of Josh Allen. They didn't lose that game because of Sean McDermott. They lost. I'm sorry, did I say win? They didn't lose that game because of Josh Allen. They didn't lose that game because of Sean McDermott. They lost because they couldn't get stops defensively. Kansas City had their way with Buffalo's defense in the second half. I'm not sure Buffalo got off the field in the second half defensively. So they're going to have to really focus in free agency and the draft on the defensive side of the ball, and I expect them to do that. But that means that not that Buffalo's going to suck. They're not. They're still going to be really good. They got a good coach. They got a good quarterback. But your best shots just went out the door. And I would say the window is either it's closing or it is closed. Granted, I said the same thing about Kansas City, and look what's happened the last 2 years. But last time I checked, Buffalo doesn't have Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. So, moving on. This is probably going to be a short podcast. I did not expect that to happen. I might have to come up with some other topics on the fly here. Third topic I want to talk about is the combine, specifically storylines we've heard the combine. In particular, Justin Fields. So Justin Fields, it's pretty obvious that the Bears are going to trade him this offseason. But not to my surprise, but to a lot of people's surprise, the market for him is pretty lukewarm right now in the NFL. And that really shouldn't surprise anybody. Justin Fields is not a good quarterback. He has playmaking ability, mostly with his legs. But from time to time, he does have some playmaking ability through the air. You can see the arm talent at times. He just hasn't been able to put it together. Is that on him or the Bears? Likely both. But he's just not that good. Now, I don't know where the narrative came from that he's good. That happened last year. I can remember Bears fans saying that they have a star. Like Big Cat was one of them from Barstool saying Justin Fields is a star. And I was like, what game are you watching? And he even got a fucking MVP vote last year. A vote. I'm dead serious. Go look it up. I never understood it. And then the entire offseason, they were hyping him up. MVP candidate. The Bears were going to be really good. And I remember saying multiple times last year, I don't know how much Justin Fields is paying his marketing team, but it's not enough. And then the Bears went out and got him DJ Moore. They already had Cole Kmet. They made some major improvements to the offensive line. They already had a pretty good backfield. So the excuses were out. And Justin Fields didn't do anything to quash or to make people think that he was the guy. He didn't do anything to make people think otherwise. And there are still Bears fans out there who will argue that he's the guy, and I promise you he's not. So then, now that they've got the number 1 overall pick, the Bears are trying to shrug and be like, well, we want to draft Caleb Williams or whatever. And they're like, well, and, we'll get a day 2 pick, maybe even a first for Justin Fields. And word of the combine is that's not the case. The NFL is much lower on Justin Fields than the public is. And I'm going to imagine, I honestly didn't think a day 2 pick was a ridiculous expectation for the Bears. We've seen several quarterbacks get traded, who are, maybe a little bit better than Fields, but not that much better. And the value has been about a day 2 pick. Like we saw it with Carson Wentz. That was originally a day 2 pick that turned into a first because he played a X amount of snaps. We saw, Matt Ryan was older, but Matt Ryan went to Indianapolis for a couple day 2 picks. It's not ridiculous. Aaron Rodgers just went to the Jets for a day 2 pick. Granted, that was a conditional, and had he played the snaps, it would have been a first. But it's not ridiculous. I didn't think that was a ridiculous expectation for the Bears, but it turns out that's not the case. I still think the Bears are going to get a day 2 pick, but it's not going to be a second. Probably not a second. I'm going to say a third. The team that was most likely to get Justin Fields, I think, was Atlanta, but now Atlanta seems to have turned its focus to Kirk Cousins, and it sounds like, I don't want to get into our free agency talk. I wanted to save that for next week, but it honestly sounds like Cousins to Atlanta is almost a done deal. So I honestly don't think it would be the worst thing in the world for the Bears to just hang on to Justin Fields. I don't know why they're so hard pressed to move on. Keep him, develop Caleb Williams, have a competition. If Caleb Williams isn't ready, which I'm not convinced he is, I'm 50-50 on whether or not he could start right away for Chicago. I don't feel that way about the other quarterbacks in this draft class. I think most probably need to sit and learn. I think Caleb Williams could probably be a starter day one, although I'm not super high on him right now. I do think he has a lot of red flags. But if he's not ready and he's not better than Fields, just put Fields out there. At least you know what you have in him. Don't pick up his fifth-year option. Start Fields another year. Let Caleb sit and learn. Shane Waldron, I think, is a good offensive coordinator. Let him develop. Then let Fields walk next year. I don't understand why everyone just thinks you have to move on from these guys. How long is it going to be before teams look, or, they do this every 15 years at this point with Green Bay. Man, how do they keep finding these quarterbacks? Well, Favre sat and learned. Granted, some of it was in Atlanta, but he sat in Green Bay for a while, learned, then it was thrust in. Aaron Rodgers sat for 3 years and learned. Jordan Love sat for 3 years and learned. And then everyone is shocked at, man, how does Green Bay keep finding all these guys? When do teams start taking the Green Bay approach? Be like, you know what? You know what we should do? We should sit these young quarterbacks and let them develop. Maybe Green Bay's onto something. But I don't see that happening. But I'm genuinely, and it's not just Green Bay. Kansas City just proved it too with Patrick Mahomes. Man, how'd they get Patrick Mahomes to work? He had so many red flags coming out of college. Well, he sat and learned. He had a great coach in Andy Reid. He had a good mentor in Alex Smith. Like maybe they're onto something. So that's why I'm just like, why is Chicago so quick to move on from Justin Fields? Even though I know he's not any good, but why not just keep him? See what you have in Caleb Williams. If he's not ready, he's not ready. And then if he's not ready, just trot out Justin Fields. The city wants him anyway. I don't get it. I don't think it would be the worst move if Chicago just said, all right, you know what, we'll stick with Justin Fields. We won't pick up his 5th-year option, but we'll keep him another year. See, maybe he gets better, but unlikely. And then if Caleb Williams isn't ready, he sits and learns. I don't get it, but I'm not in the office. I'm not in the front office. Just a fan who has a podcast. So that does it. Basically, those were the 3 topics I wanted to hit on. I'm barely 20 minutes in. Actually, not even 20 minutes in. So I'm going to do something. I was going to save it to Monday, but because I was going to try to do 2 episodes next week because I have some time off. But I'm going to go ahead and do it now. I want to look at the big board. So sticking with the combine. Let me pull up the big board. I just want to talk about some of the top picks in the draft, and I got PFF's big board here. And I got the draft order. I got the updated big board. Just wanted to talk up on some rumors. So, as we know, Chicago has the first pick in the draft right now, and which is Carolina's pick. And I wouldn't be shocked if Chicago. I almost said Carolina. If Chicago trades out of this pick, I don't think they'll do what they did last year when they traded out, which was go from 1 to I believe 9 and get like a big haul. I don't think they're going to do that. If they do trade out, I think it's going to be to like 2 or 3 to Washington or New England. And right now, I think there's rumors with some legs that Washington wants the first pick and Chicago trades back to 2. I'm honestly 50-50 on whether or not that'll happen. Maybe a little bit over 50-50. I think Washington really wants Caleb Williams. I think Chicago's a little lukewarm on Caleb Williams. But I don't see Chicago going past 2 or 3. And honestly, it wouldn't even be that much of a haul for Washington to move up from 2 to 1. If the trade between Chicago and what team was it? San Francisco, back in 2017 when Chicago moved up to get Mitchell Trubisky, moved up 1 spot from 3 to 2 to get Mitchell Trubisky. I think they only gave up like a 2, a 3, maybe a future 2 or 3. It wasn't a whole lot. So I would imagine Washington probably doesn't have to give up a future first to go from 2 to 1. I would say probably you obviously give up 2, probably a 3, maybe a couple 3s, because Washington's got a ton of draft capital. Let me see. They got 1 first-round pick. Actually, that's all I show. I didn't put in for 3 rounds. Washington has like 5 picks in the first 3 rounds or something. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. 6 in the first 4. So they got some ammo to go up and move. And then future picks on top of that. And like I said, I'm not sure it would take a future first, but maybe it would. But I don't see, I wouldn't be shocked if Chicago trades back. I actually am expecting it to happen before the draft rolls around. But I think regardless, Caleb Williams is going number 1. That seems to be his ceiling and floor right now. I don't see anyone else taking the number 1 overall spot. So the second pick, depending on the team, I don't know if Chicago would take another quarterback from North Carolina after the way Mitch Trubisky panned out. But the rumors right now are that it's going to be Jaden Daniels, and Jake May is experiencing a bit of a slide. And then the third pick, I'm expecting New England to trade back. Everything seems to point to New England's not that crazy about these quarterbacks. If they are, it might be Williams or maybe May, or maybe Jaden Daniels, and maybe they're not high on May. But I expect them to move out of this pick. I'd say I'd look at the Giants at 6. I don't think Atlanta's going to move up because I think that they got eyes on Kirk Cousins. Not the Jets. The Vikings are a possibility. I would say the Broncos are a possibility. So maybe even the Raiders. But to go from 3 to 12 is quite a fall. It would take a lot for that to happen. But, 3 to 6, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Number 4, Arizona. I don't think Arizona's going to trade out of this. At the Combine, they were very invested in Joe Alt. Several people have mocked Marvin Harrison Jr. to the Cardinals. So I think it's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. at 4. But on the off chance that Harrison Jr. goes number 3, which is not out of the realm of possibility to New England, I think Arizona would keep the fourth pick and go with Joe Alt, which would really throw a wrench in the draft order. So the Chargers, I'm like 99% sure the Chargers are trading out of 5. Just their needs don't fit the board. They need to get defensive help. Maybe the only thing here is I think if the Chargers do stay at 5, they're likely to go O line. I've maintained that opinion for weeks now. You got to remember when Jim Harbaugh took over the 49ers, he immediately addressed the trenches. I don't remember, I didn't really follow the NFL draft back then, but I remember they took Aldon Smith, and Aldon Smith was a good player, but they fortified the trenches. They added to a front seven that was already pretty good, and they had one of the best front sevens I've ever seen during the 2011 to 2014 run when they had Patrick Willis, Ahmad Brooks, Justin Smith, Aldon Smith, Glenn Dorsey was on that defensive front. There was someone else. Was there another edge rusher? I don't remember. But I think the same thing's going to happen with the Chargers. I think they're going to go defensive front or just trenches in general. Harbaugh's preaches physicality. He's going to bring physicality to the Chargers. The best way to do that and to impose, how physical you want to be is to beef up the trenches. So if the Chargers stay at 5, I think they're going to go Joe Alt. But I'm expecting the trade out. I would look at the Giants. I would look at one of these teams that wants a wide receiver. Tennessee could be one. If Alt's off the board, maybe the Jets trade up to get, Fashanu or, whoever. Maybe Minnesota or Denver moves up for a quarterback. But that's what I expect. The Giants, I think all signs are pointing to Giants are taking a quarterback right now. That could be bullshit. I don't know, obviously. But I think the ownership of the Giants is higher on Daniel Jones than the front office. The front office was kind of forced to pay Daniel Jones, and I don't blame them. They didn't really have a choice. They didn't pick up his 5th-year option. He had an okay season in 2022, and either he walked or you had to pay him. And instead of starting over at the position by letting him walk, they chose to pay him. Didn't work out. So I think they regret that contract. And if you look at the structure of the contract, it's really just a 2-year deal. And 1 year's already up. They got 1 more year. So they need to look ahead at the quarterback position. So I think 6 is probably going to be Drake May. It feels like he's falling. Like if the Giants, let's just pretend don't trade up. Let's say, Caleb Williams goes 1, Commanders go, or Jaden Daniels goes 2, Harrison goes 3, Joe Alt goes 4, Chargers trade out, maybe the Titans or someone move up to get a wide receiver, and Drake May still on the board. I would expect this to be Drake May. But as for wide receivers, there's always a run of receivers. Like teams are usually willing to wait, I feel like, in today's NFL. They're willing to wait, but the second someone picks a receiver, there's going to be a run. And that's happened like each of the last 3 to 4 years. Let me pull it up. NFL draft. So in 2020, there wasn't a receiver picked until pick 12. And then once that happened, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, and the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 picks. Like that's usually how it goes. Is they're willing to wait, but the second one of those teams gets a receiver, they all kind of panic. It's almost like drafting kickers and defenses in fantasy football, you kind of wait to see what everyone else does. And then the second that they're gone, or like the second, Justin Tucker's picked, you're like, okay, I got to get a kicker. 2021, it was similar. Jamar Chase went 5. Granted, that's not a long wait, but Jamar Chase went 5. Then it was Waddle at 6, Devontae Smith at 10. So there's usually a tier with these receivers. There's a tier 1. In 2021, it was Chase, Waddle, and Smith. Then there was a bit of a dip. And again, once that happened, once they hit that dip, the Giants ended that pick 20 in 2021. I'm looking at it with Kadarius Toney. And then a couple picks later, Rashad Bateman was picked. So that wasn't the best example because it was, like 7 picks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 picks later. And then Rashad Bateman was the last receiver picked in that draft. But we saw it in 2023, I believe. Definitely 2022. I'm looking at it. Drake London fell to 8. And then 3 of the next 4 picks were wide receiver. Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jameson Williams. And then Jahan Dotson went at 16, so 4 picks later. And then Tre'Davious Burks was 18. Once it starts, it's bam, 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 bam. And then 2023, same thing. I know that much. They waited until 20. Jackson Smith and Jigba, and then it was receiver, receiver, receiver. So that's typically the way it works with these receivers. So I imagine once Harrison Jr., let's just say, gets picked at 4, which I expect to happen, then there's going to be a run. And the Giants are in play. The Titans are in play. I think the Falcons are in play. Even the Bears. There's going to be a run with these receivers. And I think definitely 3 are going to be in the top 10. I think 3 quarterbacks, 3 receivers in the top 10. The one pass catcher that I'm just not convinced is going to be a top 10 pick, even though he's considered a top 10 player in the draft, is Brock Bowers. So Brock Bowers came in, or was measured at 6'3", 243. That's just not that much for a tight end. I'm sure. Let me look at other tight ends that were picked in the first round. Let me go back to 2020. Was there a tight end picked that round in the first round? No. 2021. Kyle Pitts went 4. He's 6'6", 245, so more of a tight end body. And if Atlanta could do that over, they wouldn't pick Kyle Pitts. 2022, was there a tight end? No. I don't remember if there was one. I don't think there was one last year. Dalton Kincaid, so 1. So there have been 2 tight ends drafted in the first round the last, 4 or 5 years. It's a position that teams usually realize is more valuable on day 2, or not valuable, but you get more bang for your buck on day 2 at the tight end position, even at the receiver position. But I've said that for years. People don't believe me, but it's true. And so Brock Bowers, I feel like, I don't think is going to be a top 10 pick. I don't see the Chargers taking him at 5. I know that had some legs there for a little bit. If he goes in the top 10, I think it's the Jets at 10. If not, it's going to be a little bit of a slide. And I don't think it's going to be Minnesota or Denver or Vegas. The Saints are a possibility. I really do think if Bowers doesn't go in the top 10, he's falling to at least 15 to Indianapolis. And I do think at some point, though, people are going to overlook, similar to Kyle Pitts, I think they're going to overlook the fact that he's a tight end. He's more of a receiver, but 6'3", 245. He's going to primarily be a slot receiver, basically. He's an okay blocker. but you're not getting Rob Gronkowski with him, I don't feel like. He strikes me very much as a player who high floor, low ceiling. He's going to be really good. His first year in the NFL, he's going to, play well, but he's not going to get much better than that. Just usually with someone with those traits at 6'3", 245, they're just not going to get much better. Physical traits usually mean you have a high ceiling, and Brock Bowers doesn't have the physical traits. Doesn't mean he's going to be a bad player. I just don't see him being an all-time great tight end, which is really what you need to be in order to be drafted high in the first round. So the Titans, I've mocked several times an offensive lineman to the Titans. I no longer think that's the case. I do think this team's going to prioritize pass catcher. Brian Callahan, the head coach of the Titans, came from Cincinnati. They saw the impact Jamar Chase made. Immediately, it's not what I would do. I would start from the ball out. Tennessee's offensive line is already really bad, but this is a really deep offensive line class. It's also a really deep wide receiver class, but again, I'm talking to a wall. But I feel like they're going to prioritize pass catcher for the most part. Atlanta is the one team in the top 10 I really don't have a read on. Chicago at 9, I think is going to go offense. I think they could go Odunze or Neighbors. Of course, so could Atlanta, but Atlanta, I don't really have a read on. They're spending so much time, I think, trying to get a veteran quarterback. They don't think they're far from competing. I kind of think they are. But honestly, if they get Kirk Cousins, I think they become the top team in the NFC South. Not really saying much, but I don't really have a read on what they're going to do in the top 10. My guess is they trade out. They could go. I think it wouldn't be ridiculous to take Jared Verse in the top 10. I think he's a top 10 player. Very productive in college. Was going to be a top 10 player last year before he elected to return to Florida State. It's not ridiculous. He's currently 18th on PFF's big board, but I don't think drafting him at 8 would be ridiculous. And Atlanta needs pass rushers. Chicago at 9, same deal. They could go like an edge rusher here, maybe a corner, but I don't think a corner is going to be picked until probably 13 or 14. That feels like, and I think the top corner in this draft, I think, is looking like Quinyon Mitchell. And I think the floor for a corner is looking like 13 to the Raiders at the absolute earliest. I think, the Jets want to do O-line. Minnesota, I think, is going to be looking at quarterbacks. Same with Denver. Vegas could be looking at quarterbacks too, but I have a feeling they're going to prioritize it in free agency. So that opens up DB for Vegas, and that's why I think like Quinyon Mitchell at 13 is probably the earliest a DB is going to go. I don't think New Orleans will go corner at 14. New Orleans is a team that they can't get past the year in front of them. They still think they're in a Super Bowl window from 2020 after losing Drew Brees, by the way. And they just can't look past their needs for that year. They can't look ahead. And that's very problematic. You can mock Green Bay all you want for looking ahead at the quarterback position when they were in a Super Bowl window, but you know who could use Jordan Love right now? The New Orleans Saints. I'm just saying. Who else can I talk about here in the draft? The Jets, like I said, I think are going to go O-line. Minnesota really sounds like is looking at quarterback, and that's not ridiculous. I think this is the right time to move on from Kirk Cousins. Minnesota has paid him a ton of money the last 6 years. He got there in 2018, about 6 seasons. They paid him a ton of money, a lot of that guaranteed money. And I just think they're ready to move on. I think the organization wanted to move on from him last year. There were heavy rumors they were looking to move up from, I think they had the 25th pick last year, or 24th pick, maybe. And they wanted to move up and get a quarterback or take Hendon Hooker at 24 or whatever pick they had. And I even mocked it on my final mock draft the night before the first round, or the day before the first round, day of, whatever. And it wasn't ridiculous. Hendon Hooker went top 60 or something. He was picked in the very next round. So the intel was clearly there. But I think the organization wanted to move on from Kirk Cousins last year, didn't do it for whatever reason. But this year's the right time. He's a free agent. He's coming off an Achilles. He's getting older. I've said this all before, but now's the time to move on, and it sure seems like that's going to happen. So Minnesota, they kind of have to have quarterback on their radar. I don't know if they'll be able to sign a veteran, possibly, but I think they're going to move up, and right now it sounds like it's going to be for J.J. McCarthy. And I want to talk about J.J. McCarthy for a minute, because James and I differ quite a bit on J.J. McCarthy. James is convinced that J.J. McCarthy is going to be a bust, that he's going to suck. And, well, I should rephrase. James and I don't differ too much on J.J. McCarthy. I should make that clear. We don't differ that much. But I can see his value. James, I don't think can. James is convinced that he's not going to be any good. He's going to suck. He's going to be a bust. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do think J.J. McCarthy has physical traits. He's got a pretty damn good arm. His frame concerns me. What did he weigh in at the combine? He's kind of like Bryce Young. Bryce Young came in at 200 at the combine, and it was the fakest 200 pounds imaginable, because I think he's clearly more like 185. So JJ McCarthy, did he weigh in? So he weighed in at 219, not horrible. He measured in at 6'2.5", a little bit shorter than I thought. 219, borderline like Jordan Love numbers. Jordan Love was 6'4", 219 the combine. But I don't think he's 219. I think he's much closer to 200 than he is 219. And that's problematic. Like, he's very slender. He doesn't have much girth to him. And I think that's going to be a problem at the next level. But with that said, he's got a really good arm. He reminds me quite a bit, actually, of Jordan Love. I don't think he's ready. He really could have used probably another year at Michigan. And like with Jordan Love, I think if he gets to the right team with the right situation, isn't forced to play right away, that he could develop into a decent quarterback or a pretty good quarterback. He's got the traits for it. Problem is, I just don't know how that's going to happen, because the teams that need a quarterback, Minnesota, if they like, Minnesota would be a good spot for him if they kept Kirk Cousins, but I don't think that's going to happen. Denver at 12, they don't have a quarterback. So unless they're going to go out and sign somebody, these teams are going to go out and sign somebody. And I don't even know who's available outside of Kirk Cousins. Minnesota ain't getting Kirk Cousins. I don't think Denver's getting Kirk Cousins. I don't even think Minnesota's getting Justin Fields. Denver might. Russell Wilson is available, so maybe Minnesota pays up for him. That's a possibility. But their options are pretty limited on the free agency front. So I just don't know where McCarthy is going to fall. That's like a really good spot for him. Like, Mahomes went to a great spot in Kansas City. He got to sit, learn from a great coach, learn from a pretty good quarterback in Alex Smith, and then he was able to take over. Same with Jordan Love. Jordan Love was able to sit for 3 years, learn from a future Hall of Famer and a great head coach in Matt LaFleur, and now look at him. I don't know where that spot is for J.J. McCarthy. I really don't. There's really not one. The Giants, maybe, like, he sits behind Daniel Jones for a year, but that's not great. Like he honestly, JJ McCarthy's probably gonna have to sit for probably 2 years at a minimum, and I don't see the spot where he's gonna flourish. So I have a hard time seeing this working out for JJ McCarthy. So that's why I'm like, I don't think James and I differ too much. James is convinced he's gonna suck. I'm not as convinced. Like it really does depend on his situation, but I don't know where the situation is. We still got a month, over a month to go. Things can change. As for other quarterbacks, somehow Bo Nix and Michael Penix have fallen out of the first round conversation. I don't get that. And I expect that to change. I firmly believe we're going to get 5 quarterbacks in the first round, potentially 6. And until I see it happen, I'm going to keep thinking it. Or, the week before the draft, if they're saying it's going to be 3 or 4, well, I believe it. Other teams, I've already talked about New Orleans, Indianapolis. Any players that I didn't touch up on? I think I did it. I think I did the podcast. So yeah, I wanted to save this conversation for next week, but is what it is. So now we go into the weekend. Very important weekend. Monday is the beginning of the free agency period where teams can talk to, so the new league year begins Wednesday, but Monday is the start of when teams can talk to free agents and start negotiating. So I'm expecting some deals to be made this weekend. I don't even, who are some of the top free agents on the market? Some of them already did get locked up, like Mike Evans, which makes sense. Kendrick Bourne, what happened to him? That was just an injury update. So right now, Kirk Cousins, I don't think we're going to know anything until, probably Monday or Wednesday of next week. All these are quarterbacks. Hang on. I expect Baker Mayfield to re-sign with Tampa. That seems like a foregone conclusion. Let's talk Russell Wilson. Should have brought that up earlier in the podcast. Where's Russell Wilson going to end up? I honestly don't know. I think a great spot for him is Pittsburgh. He needs a good brainwashing. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way or like in a bad way. I mean, look at what the Packers did with Jair Alexander. So Jair Alexander was hurt a good chunk of 2023. He comes back against Carolina. He kind of acts out at the coin toss, shows up as a captain, almost screws up the coin toss. Then I think he made some comments after the game, and Green Bay was like, dude, shut up. We're suspending you. And they suspended him for a week, and then the next week, he was a completely different player. And he was like, oh, how much he respects the front office. And then by the end of the season, there were a couple of weeks there where is Jair Alexander going to get traded? And then after the San Francisco game, he was like, no, I want to stay in Green Bay. I love this organization. I love the front office, blah, blah, blah. And he's not getting traded. But Russell Wilson needs something like that. He needs to go to a team that's going to brainwash him, where it's like, look, you're going to sign the veteran minimum deal. You're gonna, you're gonna go into boot camp and you're gonna come out a completely different player. And I think Pittsburgh can do that. Mike Tomlin, hard ass, defensive minded coach, could probably motivate Russell Wilson. Based on the rumors I've seen, it doesn't seem like Pittsburgh's interested in Russell Wilson. I don't blame him. Didn't play all that well in Denver, but Pittsburgh's another team. Can you go into next season with your current quarterback situation? I'm not sure you can. Kenny Pickett's, I don't want to say a bust because it's still kind of too early, but it certainly doesn't look good. Mitch Trubisky was a disaster as a backup. Unless you're going to get Justin Fields, which I don't think that's a better option than Russell Wilson, honestly. Why wouldn't you go get Russell Wilson for a cheap deal? Let him and Kenny Pickett compete. If Kenny Pickett can, beat him out, you know what you have. And you know what Russell Wilson is no longer capable of being a starter, if that's the case. I think he can beat out Kenny Pickett. I'm not very high on Kenny Pickett. So I think that's a really good spot for Russell Wilson. Will he go there? I'm not convinced. The other team that comes to mind is the Raiders. Raiders, I think, are going to be looking for a veteran quarterback again. I would look at the draft, but that's me. They tried with Jimmy Garoppolo. It didn't work out. But Russell Wilson, when he was in Seattle, had like a list of teams he would like to get traded to. I think the Bears were on there, and the Raiders were on there. And at the time, I thought the Raiders were a good spot for him. At the time, they had a good O-line. They had some weapons. They had John Gruden. Again, at the time, now, still have some weapons. O-line's kind of a mess. Defense is kind of a mess, although it played pretty well with Antonio Pierce as head coach. I don't know what kind of coach Antonio Pierce is. I get why they hired him. The team played really well for him as the interim. We'll see. I feel like Russell Wilson's going to go to one of those two teams. He's not going back to Denver. I'll be surprised if it's Minnesota. I feel like it's going to be Pittsburgh or Vegas, and I think Pittsburgh's a better spot for him. So, who else could it be? Let me look. Let's look. Unless he's willing to take a backup role, which I don't see happening. Buffalo, no. Miami, probably. Jets, no. Patriots, I don't think so. Baltimore, Cleveland, no. Cincinnati, no. Houston, no. Jacksonville, no. Indianapolis, no. Maybe Tennessee. I could see that potentially. Kansas City, no. Las Vegas, yes. Denver and the Chargers, no. Dallas, Philly, no. New York Giants, I highly doubt it. Washington, I don't see that happening. I think Washington's committed to the draft for a quarterback. Detroit, no. Green Bay, no. Minnesota, possibly. Chicago, no. Tampa is going to re-sign Baker Mayfield, I think. New Orleans is committed to Derek Carr. Atlanta's all in on Kirk Cousins. So not impossible, but we'll see. Carolina kind of stuck with Bryce Young. I don't see that happening. Although, would it be a horrible idea to bring in Russell Wilson for some competition with Bryce Young or as a potential backup so that Bryce Young can learn from Russell Wilson? I'm not sure that's a bad idea. San Francisco, that could be interesting. I'm going to say no, but that could be interesting for Russell Wilson. San Francisco obviously tried to get Kirk Cousins back in 2018. I'm not sure they're bought on Brock Purdy. I think they believe in him, but he really didn't answer any questions in the playoffs, and he was outplayed in all three playoff games by the opposing quarterback, including Jordan Love. So that's an interesting one. I think San Francisco, though, is going to stick with Brock Purdy. The Rams, no. Unless it's a backup role. Seattle, probably, no. Hell no. I almost said probably not. I was like, oh, wait, no, hell no. That's where Russell Wilson was before Denver. Arizona, no. So there are really only about 4 teams. Unless he's willing to take a backup role with a team I'm just not seeing. Market's kind of limited for Russell Wilson. So I'll leave it there. Talked about quite a bit. More than I originally planned to, but we're approaching an hour, so that's good. Everybody, keep your eye on your phone this weekend. I know there's going to be a big deal, maybe a few. Going to be interesting either way.